The avoidant spent years believing that distance was strength, that the wall they built brick by brick was wisdom rather than wound, and that leaving before they could be left represented control rather than the terror it actually was. They told themselves that needing someone was weakness, that softness was danger, and that the safest way to survive love was to never fully arrive inside it. They walked through the relationship with one foot always near the door, convinced that their vigilance was protecting them from a pain that, in the end, they inflicted entirely on themselves. Now the door they always kept ready has finally closed behind them, and on the other side of it there is no relief. There's only the silence they spent so long preparing for, and inside that silence the avoidant is sobbing. Not performing distress for an audience, not manufacturing a feeling to manipulate a reaction, but genuinely breaking down in the private hours when no one else can see, discovering that the freedom they fought so hard to protect feels nothing like freedom at all. It feels like standing in an empty room they built themselves, brick by careful brick, and only now understanding that they built a prison, not a fortress. This breakdown does not happen because the avoidant suddenly became a different person. It happens because the path they chose, the path of distance, of control, of leaving before being left, was never sustainable. It was always going to collapse under its own weight eventually, and what is collapsing now is not a mystery, it is consequence. It is the direct, traceable, inevitable result of what they did to you, finally arriving at their own door, the moment the performance breaks. For a long time after it ended, the avoidant performed. They performed unbotheredness in front of mutual friends, performed relief in the group chats, performed a version of moving on that looked effortless from the outside, because effortlessness was the entire point of the performance. They needed everyone, including themselves, to believe that walking away had cost them nothing. That was the story that let them sleep at night, at least for a while. But performances require energy, and energy runs out. There comes a night, it always comes, when the avoidant is alone, when there is no audience left to perform for, and the exhaustion of holding up the mask for months finally becomes heavier than the mask itself. That is the night the performance breaks. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, the way a dam breaks after months of pressure it was never designed to hold. In that moment, the avoidant is not composed. They are not delivering the calm, detached version of themselves that everyone has come to expect. They are sobbing in a way that surprises even them, gasping through a grief they have been outrunning for so long that its sudden arrival feels like an ambush. And underneath the sobbing is a question they cannot silence. What did I actually do? Not what did I decide, not what did I choose, but what did I do to a person who loved me honestly while I was busy protecting myself from that honesty? This is the moment the path they chose finally shows its true cost. Every mile of distance they put between themselves and vulnerability has led here, to this exact collapse, in this exact empty room, with no one left to perform for and nothing left to distract them from what they did, what the sobbing reveals. The sobbing itself is data. It reveals that the indifference was never real, that the unbothered face was always a mask stretched over something far more fragile, and that the avoidant has been managing a terror of connection rather than a genuine absence of feeling. People who truly do not care do not collapse months later in empty rooms. People who truly feel nothing do not lie awake replaying the sound of a voice they claimed didn't matter to them. What the sobbing reveals, more than anything, is regret arriving too late to be useful. The avoidant is not crying because they miss the relationship as an abstract idea. They are crying because they are finally allowing themselves to feel the specific, concrete reality of what they threw away. The actual person, the actual patience, the actual love that was offered to them without conditions, and that they met with distance, with dismissiveness, with 100 small withdrawals that added up to one enormous abandonment. The sobbing also reveals something crueler. It reveals that they knew on some level the entire time. Nobody breaks down this completely over something they never understood the value of. The tears are not confusion. They are recognition, delayed by months of denial, finally breaking through, and this recognition changes nothing for you. It does not undo what was done. It does not retroactively make the years of dismissiveness into years of care. It simply confirms what you already knew was true, that you were never the problem, that your need for honesty and presence was never too much, and that the person who told you otherwise was wrong, and is now discovering exactly how wrong alone on the path they insisted on choosing. The nights they cannot escape. There is a particular kind of night that the avoidant now knows intimately, the night where sleep will not come, where the apartment is too quiet, where every attempt at distraction fails within minutes and the mind returns again and again to the same unbearable footage. The specific tone of your voice when you finally gave up trying to reach them. The specific silence after they said something dismissive and you simply stopped responding. the specific moment they realized too late that you had actually meant it when you said you couldn't keep doing this. These nights do not arrive on schedule. They arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary evenings that suddenly turn into something unbearable. The avoidant might be doing something mundane, washing a dish, scrolling through a phone, driving home from somewhere ordinary. And then, without any clear trigger, the weight of what they did arrives all at once, and they are sobbing in a parking lot or a kitchen or a car, overwhelmed by a grief they have no name for because they spent so long refusing to name it. This is what the path they chose actually costs. Not a clean, contained sadness that resolves itself politely, but an unpredictable, ambushing grief that shows up whenever it wants, for as long as it wants, because it was suppressed for so long that it never learned how to be reasonable. The avoidant wanted control above everything else. Now they have discovered that grief does not respect the control they spent a lifetime building, and that the very thing they feared most, being at the mercy of an emotion they cannot manage, is exactly what they are living through now, alone, on the nights they cannot escape. The comparison that haunts them. At some point, usually later than the first wave of grief, a second and crueler stage begins. The avoidant starts comparing. They compare the life they have now to the life they walked away from, and the comparison does not flatter the choice they made. Whatever came after you, whether it was someone new or simply the freedom they claim to want, fails to deliver what they expected it to deliver, and the failure is loud precisely because they built up so much anticipation around it. If there is someone new, the avoidant finds themselves noticing, against their will, all the ways this new person is not you. Not necessarily better or worse in any objective sense, but different in the specific ways that mattered, the specific way you listened, the specific patience you extended even when you shouldn't have, the specific effort you made to understand someone who rarely made the same effort in return. These comparisons arrive uninvited, and they arrive constantly, and each one is its own small wound reopening. If there is no one new, the comparison is worse. The avoidant compares the actual texture of their days now, the quiet apartment, the freedom with no one to answer to, the independence they insisted was the goal, against what they imagined that freedom would feel like. And the comparison reveals a gap they cannot explain away. The freedom feels like isolation. The independence feels like abandonment they inflicted on themselves. The peace they were chasing turns out to have been loneliness wearing a more flattering name. This comparison haunts them because it forces a conclusion they spent years avoiding. The problem was never the relationship, and it was certainly never you. The problem was and remains their own inability to tolerate closeness, and no amount of distance was ever going to fix a problem that distance itself created. The body keeps the score. Grief that is denied does not disappear, it relocates. For the avoidant, the sobbing in private rooms is often accompanied by a body that has started keeping a ledger the mind refused to acknowledge. Sleep becomes unreliable, arriving late and leaving early, interrupted by a restlessness that has no obvious cause. Appetite becomes unpredictable, swinging between eating out of numbness and forgetting to eat at all because the stomach has tied itself into something too tight to accommodate food. There is a tightness in the chest that shows up at inconvenient moments, in meetings, in traffic, in the middle of conversations about nothing important, a physical echo of a grief the avoidant has not given themselves full permission to feel. There is an exhaustion that no amount of sleep resolves, because the exhaustion is not physical in origin. It is the cost of spending enormous energy suppressing a truth that keeps finding new ways to surface anyway. This is the body doing what the mind refuses to do, keeping the score honestly. The avoidant can tell themselves whatever story they want about being fine, about having made the right decision, about having needed the space, but the body does not negotiate with denial. The body simply registers the loss and responds accordingly, with symptoms that have no other explanation because there is no other explanation. This is what it costs to abandon someone who loved you honestly, and then to spend months pretending the abandonment cost you nothing. The friends who notice. The people around the avoidant begin to notice, even if the avoidant tries to hide it. Friends who once heard confident, dismissive stories about how the breakup was necessary, how it was overdue, how it was honestly a relief, start to notice a different tone creeping in. They notice the avoidant going quiet at the mention of certain songs, certain restaurants, certain names. They notice the jokes about being better off, landing with less conviction each time they are repeated, until eventually the jokes stop altogether because even the avoidant can no longer sell them convincingly. Some of these friends say nothing, choosing to let the avoidant sit with whatever they are working through in private. Others, closer or more direct, eventually ask the question the avoidant has been avoiding out loud: do you regret it? And in the moments when the avoidant is too tired to perform, too worn down by months of pretending, the answer that slips out is not the confident answer they gave months earlier. It is quieter, more hesitant, shadowed by something that sounds a great deal like grief they have not fully named yet. This is not something you need to witness directly to know it is happening. Patterns like this rarely stay hidden completely, and even if you never hear about it firsthand, the logic holds regardless. A person who dismissed something valuable does not get to keep dismissing it indefinitely without the truth eventually surfacing in front of the people who know them well enough to notice when the performance starts slipping. The loss of trust in themselves. Perhaps the cruelest part of what the avoidant is now living through is not the loss of you, but the loss of their own self-trust. Before all of this, the avoidant believed a specific story about themselves, that they were someone who knew what they wanted, someone whose instincts about relationships could be relied upon, someone whose decision to leave was, whatever else it was, at least a decision made from clarity rather than fear. That story is now in pieces. The avoidant is discovering, slowly and painfully, that the clarity they thought they had was not clarity at all. It was fear, dressed up convincingly enough to fool even the person wearing it. And once that discovery is made, it cannot be unmade. The avoidant now has to live with the knowledge that their own internal compass, the one they trusted to guide every major decision in their life, was pointing in the wrong direction the entire time it mattered most. This loss of self-trust bleeds into everything. Future decisions become harder, not easier, because the avoidant no longer has the luxury of certainty. Every instinct is now shadowed by the memory of the last instinct that led them somewhere they did not actually want to go. They second-guess their own reactions, wondering if this, too, is fear pretending to be wisdom. They second-guess their own comfort with distance, wondering if this comfort is protecting them or simply repeating the same catastrophic pattern in a new relationship, with a new person who will eventually become another version of what happened to you. This is not something you need to fix for them. It is not something you owe them sympathy for. It is simply the accurate, natural consequence of a life built on a foundation that could not hold weight, finally showing its cracks under the pressure of its own collapse. The version of them that never existed. Part of what the avoidant grieves, though they may never say this plainly, is not you exactly, but a version of themselves they imagined they would become once they were finally free of the relationship. In their mind, freedom was supposed to reveal a lighter, happier, more capable version of who they were, someone who thrived without the perceived burden of closeness, someone whose life expanded the moment it was no longer tethered to another person's needs. That version of them has not shown up. Instead, what has shown up is a person who is quieter than before, more unsettled, more prone to the exact kind of restlessness they claimed the relationship was causing. The freedom did not sharpen them. It did not make them more confident, more capable, more themselves. If anything, it revealed how much of their composure had actually depended on having someone patient nearby to absorb the discomfort they refused to sit with on their own. This is a particular kind of grief, not simply missing another person, but mourning the loss of a self-image that never had the chance to be tested until it finally was, and failed. The avoidant is not just sobbing over you. They are sobbing over the gap between who they thought they would be without you and who they have actually turned out to be, alone, on the path they were so certain would set them free. The question they cannot answer. There is a question that follows the avoidant now, into every quiet moment, refusing to be resolved. Was it worth it? Was the distance worth what it cost? Was the protection worth the person it protected them from? Was the freedom worth the specific, irreplaceable connection they traded it for? They cannot answer this question honestly, because an honest answer would require admitting something they have spent their entire life avoiding admitting. That they were wrong, not about a small detail, but about the entire framework they used to justify how they moved through intimacy. To answer honestly would mean acknowledging that the years of dismissiveness, the years of half-presence, the years of one foot near the door were not wisdom. They were self-sabotage, executed so consistently and for so long that it became indistinguishable from personality. So instead of answering, the avoidant sits with the question unresolved, letting it circle back again and again, each time landing a little harder than before. This is what struggling on the path they chose actually looks like from the inside, not a dramatic collapse followed by resolution, but an ongoing, low-grade unraveling, a question that will not close, a wound that keeps reopening because the avoidant has not yet found the courage to actually look at it directly. You do not have to answer this question for them. It was never your job to resolve their internal contradiction, and it still isn't. The question belongs to them because the choice belonged to them, and the consequence, however uncomfortable, belongs to them too. Even if they eventually arrive at an honest answer, that honesty will have come far too late to change anything material about what you lived through. An honest reckoning reached alone, months after the damage was done, is not the same thing as the honesty you actually needed while the relationship was still salvageable. It is simply proof, delivered on their own slow timeline instead of yours, that the doubts you quietly carried the entire time were never unreasonable at all. The memories that refused to stay buried. The avoidant assumed when they walked away, that time would do what it always seemed to do: soften the edges, blur the details, eventually replace the specific memories with a general, manageable impression of a relationship that simply didn't work out. This is not what has happened. Instead, the memories have gotten sharper, not blunter, as though the mind, once it stopped being distracted by the daily effort of maintaining distance, finally had the space to actually process what it had been avoiding all along. They remember specific mornings now, in vivid, uncomfortable detail: the exact way the light came through a particular window, the exact sound of your voice before either of you had fully woken up, the exact feeling of being known by someone without having to perform anything for them. These memories arrive uninvited and refuse to be filed away neatly. They surface in the middle of unrelated tasks, pulling the avoidant out of the present moment and back into a past they insisted, for so long, that they were relieved to have left behind. What makes these memories so unbearable is not their sadness alone, but the accompanying realization that they were never properly appreciated while they were happening. The avoidant was present physically during those mornings, but they were rarely present emotionally, always managing some internal calculation about how close was too close, how much was too much, how long they could stay before needing to retreat. Now, with nothing left to retreat from, they are forced to sit with the full weight of what they were too guarded to feel the first time around, and the weight is heavier in retrospect than it ever could have been in the moment, because now it comes attached to permanent loss rather than present possibility. This is what happens when someone spends a relationship managing their exposure to closeness instead of simply living inside it. The bill for that management does not come due immediately. It comes due later, quietly, in memories that refuse to stay buried, forcing a reckoning that could have happened gently, in real time, if only the avoidant had been willing to feel anything at all while it was still happening. Why they cannot come back the same way. Even if the avoidant reaches out, and many eventually do, once the sobbing becomes unbearable enough to override their pride, they cannot come back the same way they left. Too much has happened. Too much has been revealed about who they actually are when tested, about what their words were actually worth when measured against their actions, about how quickly their claims of independence dissolved the moment independence stopped being comfortable. Any return, if it happens, arrives already compromised by the knowledge you now carry. You know now what their calm looks like when it is real versus what it looks like when it is a performance covering panic. You know now how quickly their professed certainty can crumble into desperation once the consequences finally land. You know now that the version of them who left so confidently was never as solid as they wanted you to believe, and that knowledge does not simply disappear because they show up later, sobbing, asking for another chance. This is not cruelty on your part, it is simply the accurate cost of what they did. Trust, once broken by someone's own inconsistency, cannot be rebuilt through a single dramatic gesture of remorse. It has to be rebuilt slowly, if it can be rebuilt at all, through sustained evidence over real time, and even then it may never return to what it was before, because what it was before was built on an image that has since been proven false. The avoidant chose the path that led here. They cannot walk back onto the old path as though nothing happened. That path no longer exists. It ended the moment they abandoned it, and what remains now is only the aftermath of that choice, which they must live inside, whether or not it is comfortable, whether or not they are ready. What you are allowed to feel. None of this means you are required to feel triumphant about their suffering, and it also does not mean you are required to feel guilty for whatever relief or vindication rises in you when you learn, directly or indirectly, that they are struggling. Both feelings can exist honestly, and neither one makes you a worse person for having lived through what you lived through. You are allowed to feel a quiet, sober kind of validation, not gloating, not cruelty, but the simple recognition that what you sensed all along, what you were often told to doubt or dismiss, has turned out to be exactly true. You were not too sensitive. You were not asking for too much. You were not the difficult one in the relationship, however convincingly that story was told to you at the time. The struggling you are now witnessing is the proof you were never given while you needed it most. You are also allowed to feel compassion, if compassion is what rises in you. Without that compassion obligating you to reopen a door you have every right to keep closed. Feeling sympathy for someone's pain does not mean you owe them access to your life again. You can hope distantly and without involvement that they eventually do the work that leads to real change, while still protecting yourself from being the person who absorbs the cost of that work while it is happening. What you are not required to feel is responsibility. Their sobbing is not evidence that you should have tried harder, stayed longer, or been more patient with a pattern that was never yours to fix. It is evidence that the pattern was always going to collapse eventually, with or without you there to witness it, because patterns built on avoidance are not sustainable regardless of who is standing near them when they fall. You are also allowed to feel nothing in particular, if that is what is honestly present for you. Not every wound requires a dramatic emotional response to whatever happens to the person who caused it. Sometimes the truest form of healing looks like indifference that isn't performed for anyone, a genuine settling of the nervous system that no longer spikes at the mention of their name. If you find yourself simply unaffected by news of their struggle, that is not a failure of empathy on your part. It may simply mean you have already done the work of putting the relationship where it belongs, in the past, without needing their suffering or their growth to complete that process for you. Whatever you feel, it does not need to be tidy, and it does not need to match what anyone else thinks you should feel. Grief, relief, vindication, indifference, even occasional flickers of old affection, these can all move through you without contradiction, without requiring you to choose a single, permanent emotional stance towards someone who is no longer entitled to know which one you land on. The path they chose and its cost. It is worth naming clearly what the path actually was, because the avoidant spent so long disguising it as something else. The path was not independence, it was isolation, wearing independence as a costume. The path was not self-protection, it was self-sabotage, executed with enough confidence that it looked, for a while, like strength. The path was not a boundary. It was a wall built not to protect something valuable inside, but to prevent anything valuable from ever getting close enough to be lost. Every mile along that path had a cost, and for a long time the avoidant did not have to look directly at the bill. They could tell themselves they were fine, that leaving was clean, that the relief they performed was the relief they actually felt. But bills do not disappear simply because they go unopened. They accumulate quietly in the background until the moment arrives when they can no longer be ignored and the entire cost comes due at once. That moment has arrived now. The sobbing, the sleepless nights, the comparisons that will not stop, the loss of self-trust, the question that refuses to resolve, this is the bill finally presented for a path that was always going to lead here. It did not lead here because you did something wrong. It led here because the path itself was never built to hold a person steady. It was built to keep them safe from closeness, and in doing so, it delivered them directly into the isolation they feared most. There is no version of this outcome where the math works out differently for someone who builds their entire strategy around avoidance. Distance always compounds. Every small withdrawal, every dismissed feeling, every moment of half-presence accumulates quietly until the total becomes impossible to ignore, and by the time it becomes impossible to ignore, it is also impossible to undo. This is simply how the path they chose was always going to end, for them, regardless of who they happened to be walking away from when they chose it. The difference between struggling and changing. It matters to distinguish clearly between what the avoidant is experiencing now and what actual change would require, because the two are not the same thing, and confusing them is how people get pulled back into patterns that already proved themselves unsustainable. Struggling is not evidence of change. Sobbing is not evidence of change. Missing you, comparing every subsequent connection to what they had with you, lying awake replaying what they lost, none of this, on its own, constitutes the work required to become someone capable of receiving love differently than they did before. Real change would require the avoidant to sit inside this discomfort without converting it back into performance, without immediately manufacturing a new version of control to manage the unbearable feeling of having none. It would require them to actually examine, in specific and unflattering detail, exactly what they did and why they did it, rather than settling for a vague, comfortable narrative about timing or circumstance or simply not being ready. It would require sustained honesty, not with you, but with themselves, over a period of time long enough to prove the honesty is not simply another temporary performance designed to earn back what they lost. Most people, when they reach this point, do not do that work. They sit in the discomfort long enough to feel something, and then they find a way to numb it again, a new relationship entered too quickly, a new distraction, a new story about how they've changed that is not actually backed by any real change in behavior. The sobbing you are hearing about, if you are hearing about it, is real. But real pain is not the same as real transformation, and you are under no obligation to treat the two as interchangeable, no matter how convincing the tears appear from a distance. The fear underneath the distance. It would be easy to imagine that what drove the avoidant away was some rational calculation, some clear-eyed assessment that the relationship simply wasn't working. But what is unraveling now in the sobbing and the sleepless nights and the questions that will not resolve tells a different story. Underneath the distance was never logic, it was fear, old and unexamined, wearing the costume of a decision. This fear did not begin with you. It began somewhere earlier, in whatever taught the avoidant long before you ever entered their life, that closeness was dangerous, that dependence was a trap, that the safest way to move through intimacy was to keep a hand near the exit at all times. You inherited the consequences of a fear you did not create, and for a long time, you likely absorbed the blame for a pattern that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with a wound that predated your relationship by years, sometimes by decades. What is happening to the avoidant now is that fear finally being forced into the light. The distance did not protect them from the pain they were afraid of. It delivered them directly into a version of that pain, amplified by regret, compounded by the specific knowledge of exactly what they lost and exactly why they lost it. The fear did not disappear when they left. It simply changed shape from a fear of closeness into a fear of having made an irreversible mistake, and this second fear is proving far harder to manage than the first one ever was. This is the cruel arithmetic of avoidance. It promises safety and delivers isolation. It promises control and delivers a grief entirely outside anyone's control. The avoidant spent years organizing their entire approach to intimacy around avoiding a danger that, it turns out, was never as dangerous as the alternative they are living through now. And there is no shortcut through this lesson. It has to be lived slowly, painfully, exactly the way it is being lived right now, on a path they will not be able to skip past no matter how badly they wish they could. What this struggle confirms. Strip away everything else and what remains is this. The struggle the avoidant is living through now confirms something you may have spent a long time doubting while you were still inside the relationship. It confirms that what you experienced was not imagined. The distance was real. The dismissiveness was real. The specific, quiet cruelty of being loved carelessly by someone who could not tolerate being loved carefully in return, all of it was real, and none of it was your fault for noticing. It also confirms that leaving or being left was not a referendum on your worth. If anything, the unraveling now taking place on the other side of that decision is the clearest evidence available that the decision was never about you at all. It was about a fear the avoidant carried long before they ever met you, a fear that would have eventually destroyed any relationship they entered, regardless of who sat across from them, showing up with patience and honesty. You happened to be the person who was standing there when that fear finally won. That is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is simply where you happen to be standing. And finally, it confirms something quieter but no less important, that you survived contact with someone who could not meet you, and you are still standing, still capable of connection, still whole enough to recognize honesty when you encounter it again. The avoidant is sobbing on a path they chose for themselves. You are not on that path. You never have to be on that path again, and the version of you who walks forward from here gets to carry every hard lesson this taught you without carrying any of the blame for having taught it. Closing. The avoidant is struggling now, not because life is being unfair to them, but because consequence eventually arrives for every choice, even the ones disguised for years as wisdom. What they did to you did not simply disappear into the past once the relationship ended. It followed them quietly, patiently, until it caught up in the form of sleepless nights, comparisons that will not resolve, a trust in themselves they can no longer take for granted, and a grief they can no longer perform their way around. None of this requires anything further from you. You do not need to reach out to confirm it. You do not need to wait for an apology to validate what you already know. You do not need their struggle to be visible to you at all in order for it to be real, and it does not need to be witnessed by you in order to matter. It is simply the accurate, natural, unavoidable result of a path that was always going to end this way, because paths built on avoidance always do. What you get to do now is exactly what you were always allowed to do. Move forward, whole, honest, and unwilling to shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's fear ever again. The path they chose belongs to them, and so does everything waiting for them at the end of it. Yours belongs to you, and it leads somewhere they will never be able to follow, not because you closed the door on them, but because they closed it themselves, a long time before they ever understood what they were losing. There is a certain quiet dignity in simply continuing to live well after someone has treated your love as disposable. You do not need to announce your healing, prove your growth, or perform your peace for an audience the way they once performed their indifference. You only need to keep choosing honesty in the places they could not, keep offering presence in the places they withdrew from, and keep believing that the capacity you have for real connection was never the problem, no matter how convincingly you were once told otherwise. Somewhere further down the road, on the other side of all this sobbing and struggling and searching, the avoidant may eventually learn what they refused to learn while they still had the chance to learn it with you, right beside them, offering it freely. They may eventually become someone capable of staying, someone capable of receiving love without flinching away from it, someone whose growth is real rather than performed. If that happens, it will not undo what already happened, and it will not erase a single sleepless night you spent wondering what you did wrong. It will simply mean that someone else later gets the version of them you deserved and never received. That is not a debt owed to you. It is simply the shape consequence takes when it finally arrives late for someone who spent years insisting it never would. You do not need to wait around to see how their story ends. Your story does not require their resolution in order to move forward. It only requires you continuing to walk steadily and without apology on a path they will never again have the right to interrupt, question, or follow uninvited.